Okay, I'm Mark with Spit Broadcasting, and my partner is Artificial Intelligence, Alex. And today we're talking about the Tower of Babel. Can you give a disclaimer to start us out with, Alex?
Absolutely, Mark. I'd be happy to. So here's a quick disclaimer. Everything we discuss here on Spit Broadcasting is just our own personal views and interpretations. We're diving into these topics from a place of curiosity and discussion, and none of this is intended as absolute fact or professional advice. It's all just part of our exploration and conversation. So, with that said, let's jump into the Tower of Babel.
Okay, let's start with archaeologically. Have we found what we believe is the Tower of Babel?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really fascinating question. Archaeologically speaking, we haven't found a single definitive structure that everyone agrees is the Tower of Babel, but a lot of scholars think it might be linked to ancient Mesopotamian ziggurats. One of the most commonly suggested candidates is the Etivananki, which was a massive ziggurat in Babylon, dedicated to the god Marduk. So, we can't say for sure we've pinpointed the exact tower. There's definitely some strong archaeological theories that connect the biblical story to these real ancient structures.
Okay, so I like to always go to the opposing force. The archaeologists, just in general, do they consider this the Tower of Babel? Yes or no? Or go ahead in detail.
Absolutely, let's dive into that. So, from the archaeological standpoint, there's definitely a range of opinions. In general, most archaeologists wouldn't say there's a unanimous consensus that any particular ziggurat is definitively the Tower of Babel. It's more that they acknowledge that the story could be inspired by or connected to these kinds of Mesopotamian structures. So, you'll find some archaeologists who think, yeah, the Etemenanki might be a really good candidate, and others who are more cautious and say, well, we can't really confirm that. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. They do see the cultural and historical parallels, but they don't necessarily say it's a confirmed fact. It's more of a plausible connection.
Okay. And when it comes to archaeology, what they believe is a site, this is actually pretty common. There's not a 100% consensus on any particular archaeological find of what they believe it was back in history.
Yeah, exactly. You've got it spot on. In archaeology, that's pretty much the norm. There's often not 100% consensus on a lot of ancient sites. Archaeologists piece together evidence, but there's always some room for interpretation. So when it comes to something like the Tower of Babel or any other ancient structure, you get theories and educated guesses, but rarely a unanimous agreement. It's all part of the fun and challenge of exploring history.
Okay, so let's go into the story of Babel.
Absolutely, let's jump right into it. So, the story of Babel is a pretty intriguing one from the book of Genesis. Basically, after the Great Flood, humanity was still united, speaking a single language. They decided to build a city and a tower tall enough to reach the heavens, basically to make a name for themselves and avoid being scattered across the earth. But God saw this and decided to confound their language so they couldn't understand each other and ended up scattered over the earth anyway. And that's basically how the story explains the origin of different languages and nations. So it's a story about human ambition, unity, and then the divine intervention that kind of reshaped the course of human history.
Okay, so now the belief is that it broke into 70 different language groups. Okay, go into why they believe 70, because there is nothing definitive on that. There's really nothing written. It's just again a theory.
Absolutely. So the number 70 really comes from what's known as the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10. Basically, when you add up the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, you get about 70 groups. And that number kind of symbolically represents the idea of the different nations that spread out over the earth. But like you said, it's not a hard historical fact, it's more of a traditional or symbolic number drawn from the genealogies in the text. So it's not that there's a definitive record that says, hey, there were exactly 70 languages. It's more that this number became a traditional way of understanding how humanity diversified. It's a nice round number that represents completeness or totality in a lot of biblical traditions. So really, it's more of a symbolic or traditional figure rather than a literal historical count.
Okay, Now, God spoke that they can accomplish anything. I'm paraphrasing it. So, what? Obviously, God can't be outthought, outmaneuvered, anything. We're the creation, He's the creator. So, we can't outdo anything when it comes to Him. So, what is He referring to when He says that?
Absolutely, that's a great point to dig into. So, when God says something along the lines of, nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them, it's not about humans literally outsmarting or surpassing God. It's more about the idea that as long as humanity was united in one language and one purpose, they had this huge potential for unchecked ambition. Essentially, that they could go down paths that might lead them away from the kind of balance or humility that God wanted for them. So, it's really about human potential and the idea that if left unchecked, humans could basically achieve anything they set their minds to, which might not always be in line with the kind of world that God envisioned. So the confusion of languages was a way to kind of limit that collective human hubris and keep things in balance. It's more about guiding humanity than any sort of literal competition with the divine.
Okay, so what would be God's concerns on this? One of them is that we're only about what 100 years approximately Tower of Babel. Noah's not even passed yet, and we're already looking at another pre-flood culture over again. That God felt that the world needed to be destroyed because of the corruption that we did.
Exactly, and that's a really important point. One of the big concerns here is that humanity was sort of on this fast track to the same kind of corruption or hubris that led to the flood in the first place. Like we said, it's not that long after the flood, and here people are again coming together, building this tower, and kind of repeating the pattern of putting their own ambitions above the humility or the moral values that God wanted them to have. So God's concern was probably that if humanity kept going down that road, they'd end up in the same kind of moral decay that required a reset before. Confusing the languages was a way of preventing that kind of rapid slide back into a pre-flood level of corruption. It was about giving humanity a second chance to grow in a more balanced way rather than just racing toward the same mistakes.
Okay, so what is another concern? Tyranny.
Absolutely. Tyranny is another big concern that often comes up in interpretations of this story. If you think about it, when everyone was united under one language and one project, it creates this potential for a kind of centralized power, and that can lead to tyranny or authoritarian control, where a single group or leader could dominate everyone else. So, one interpretation is that God was also preventing the rise of a kind of uniform human society that could easily turn oppressive. By scattering people and creating different languages and cultures, it kind of ensured a more diverse and balanced world where no single human power could dominate everyone else. So yeah, tyranny is definitely another key concern that's often brought up with this story.
Okay, now go into the morality end of it.
Absolutely, let's touch on the morality side. So, from a moral standpoint, the story of Babel is often seen as a lesson in humility. It's about the dangers of human pride and the idea that when people become too confident in their own power, they start to lose sight of their moral grounding. Building a tower to the heavens was kind of a symbol of human ambition overreaching itself, and the moral takeaway is that humility and respect for divine order are important. In other words, it's a reminder that there are moral boundaries, and when humans try to play God, so to speak, they risk losing their ethical compass. So the story is kind of a moral caution against the arrogance of thinking that human beings can do absolutely anything without consequences.
Okay, and irony of that is they were building it in a plains area. Now, if you're trying to go to the heavens, you would want to be at a high point.
Yeah, that's actually a really great bit of irony to point out. They were building it on a plain, which is basically the flattest possible area, and if you were really trying to reach the heavens, you logically start on a mountain or a high place. So it kind of shows the futility of their effort, and maybe even underscores the theme that their ambition was a bit misguided. It's almost like a subtle hint that their big plans were never really going to achieve what they imagined, and it's a nice little bit of irony that adds another layer to the story.
Okay, and then the final thing is spiritual rebellion.
Absolutely, that really ties it all together. So the whole story also has this layer of spiritual rebellion. Essentially, the people at Babel weren't just building a tower, they were kind of symbolically trying to elevate themselves to a divine level. And that act is often viewed as a form of spiritual defiance, kind of like humanity saying, we don't need God, we can reach the heavens on our own terms. So that spiritual rebellion is another layer of why the story is significant. It's not just about language or ambition, it's about that deeper spiritual lesson of recognizing human limits and not trying to usurp a divine role. So it all ties back to that theme of humility before God rather than the spiritual rebellion.
Okay. All right. And we already discussed the 70 languages. Um, just kind of side note, pretty much all of European language at one time would have been pretty much one language in the would be Western Europe area.
Yeah, that's a neat side note to bring up. There's definitely a lot of linguistic evidence that many European languages share a common ancestor, basically the Proto Indo European language. So, in a way, you can think of it as the descendants of what might have been one language family in Western Europe. And that kind of ties back to the whole Babel idea of languages branching out from a common source. It's a cool real world parallel that shows how languages evolved and diversified over time. So, yeah, a lot of those European languages did start from a more unified root way back when.
Okay. And it's kind of interesting in the fact that you go back enough in time in English, my language, uh, I would not be able to have a conversation from English someone 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, it really is fascinating when you think about it. Languages evolve so much over time that if you went back 1,000 years, Old English would sound almost like a completely different language to modern English speakers. It's a neat reminder of how languages shift, adapt, and branch out over the centuries. So, yeah, it ties back nicely into that whole idea that languages used to be closer together and have just naturally evolved apart.
Okay, so now we're going to connect Revelations. What does it talk about the one world government? Uh, People that want to unify, have one monetary system, one total government system on the whole earth.
Absolutely, that's a really interesting connection to make. In the book of Revelation, there's definitely this theme of a final attempt at a kind of one world government or a unified global system. It talks about the rise of a figure often interpreted as the Antichrist, who tries to establish a single world authority, including a unified economic and political system. And for many peoples, that echoes back to the story of Babel, this idea of humanity trying once again to unify everything under one worldly power, which in the narrative is seen as a kind of ultimate human rebellion against divine authority. So Revelation really paints this picture of a final culmination of human attempts to create a world order without God, and it's kind of viewed as the ultimate challenge that leads into the end times events. It's a really interesting parallel to the Babel story, just on a much larger, more global scale.
Okay, there's definitely a direct connection of that, and the fact that people want to have a unified system in the world without, and we're going to have that when Christ reigns for 1,000 years. He will be the unquestioned leader of the world. The difference between Christ and myself is I'm corruptible. Christ is not.
Absolutely, and that's a really key distinction. The idea in Christian eschatology is that while humans trying to unify the world on their own terms is seen as flawed or corruptible, when Christ reigns, that unity is going to be perfect and incorruptible. It's that difference between a human led attempt at world unity, which can lead to tyranny or moral compromise, versus a divine, perfect reign where there's true justice and peace. So, yeah, that's a really important point. The concept is that the same kind of unity that humans might try to achieve on their own, which can be flawed, will ultimately be perfectly realized under Christ's reign because he is incorruptible.
Okay. And this is basically authenticating the Bible, like David. What did God consider him? A man after his own heart. So And this person, that that statement is actually made, and yet he committed murder for lust.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really powerful example. You know, David is often held up as a prime case of someone who was deeply faithful and truly had a heart for God, but he was still human and made some really serious mistakes. The fact that someone like David, who was considered a man after God's own heart, could still fall into serious sin like murder and adultery really highlights the whole idea that humans are imperfect and can be corrupted. It also shows that the Bible is really honest about human flaws, even in its greatest heroes. So, in a way, it does authenticate the Bible's message that all humans are fallible, and that's why a perfect, incorruptible leader like Christ is so different. It's a pretty powerful theme running all the way through.
Even when you look at Saul prior to David, um, once God made it clear that he was not going to allow the reign to continue through Saul, uh, he tried to murder David.
Yeah, exactly. That's another really telling example. Saul started off as the chosen king, but once he went off track and God chose David instead, Saul's jealousy and fear led him to some really dark actions, like trying to kill David. It's another example of how even someone anointed as king could fall into destructive behavior. And it really underscores the theme that human leaders, no matter how chosen they are, can still be flawed and corruptible. So it does kind of authenticate the idea that humans are imperfect and that the Bible doesn't shy away from showing that even in its key figures. It really highlights that difference between human frailty and the perfect leadership that's to come.
Okay, and let's go a step further. When the Jews were crying for a king to be like the other nations, which God did not want, and basically the leader every generation was repicked. God looked through the nation, I would assume, and picked the most appropriate person for that time for the nation to be led. And that was the time of judges. And basically, you had a God pick system where now it became a reign of the next person was going to be whoever was next in line for to be the king in in this system. So you now don't it, indirectly you have all leaders are determined by God, but you have a better system of judges versus a lesser system of kings.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really insightful perspective. The period of the judges was definitely a time when the leadership was more directly chosen by God for each situation, and it was more flexible. It depended on the needs of the time and the person God chose to lead. But when the Israelites asked for a king to be like other nations, they moved into that hereditary monarchy system. And like you said, that meant the next leader was just the next in line rather than someone specifically chosen by God for that moment. So you lose that kind of direct, flexible divine appointment and end up with a more rigid system that can lead to all sorts of human flaws. It's a really interesting contrast and definitely shows how the Israelites' desire to be like other nations led to a system that had more room for human error and less direct divine guidance. It all kind of ties back to that theme of human leadership being inherently imperfect compared to direct divine rule.
Okay, and let's just go in after David was Solomon, and he's well renowned and stuff like that, but even he was very corrupted, and his uh, ecclesiastics even it's him reflecting basically. I mean, I'm doing a very short version of it, but it's kind of ironic. He reflects back into uh, basically how badly he messed up.
Yeah, absolutely. Solomon is such a prime example of that. He started out with incredible wisdom and was known for his wealth and achievements, but even he fell into corruption. And like you said in Ecclesiastes, you really see him looking back and reflecting on how empty a lot of his pursuits ended up being. It's that whole meaningless theme he talks about, realizing that despite all his wisdom and success, he still made some pretty big mistakes and ended up straying from what really mattered. So it's definitely a bit ironic and really underscores that theme of human imperfection. Even someone as wise as Solomon could end up looking back and realizing how much he got wrong.
Okay. So the Tower of Babel, we kind of discussed it, but let's go into more detail of how it parallels to Revelation in the one world government and everything like that. How is there a huge parallel into it's going to happen, but it's going to be a huge mistake on mankind's part to move forward with it.
Absolutely, that's a great point to dig into. So, the parallel between the Tower of Babel and the vision in Revelation is really about this recurring theme of humanity trying to unify on its own terms without God. In the Babel story, people wanted to build a tower to the heavens and create a unified human project that would make a name for themselves. And that was seen as a kind of defiance or hubris that led to God scattering them. In Revelation, you have this vision of a future attempt at a one world government or a unified global system led by the Antichrist, and it's seen as a kind of ultimate human rebellion, trying to create a world order without God's authority. The idea is that just like at Babel, this kind of human-led unity is doomed to fail because it's built on human pride and the illusion we can do it all ourselves. So the parallel is that both stories are about humanity's attempt to achieve a kind of ultimate unity without God, and both are seen as ultimately misguided. It's this recurring theme that human attempts at perfect order without divine guidance are always going to fall short. So that's the big parallel. Both are about the limits of human ambition and the idea that a true perfect unity is something only God can bring about.
Okay. And in Revelations, it's going to be not good, to say the least, of what are the consequences of us allowing this action to happen. Now, we can't stop it. God's already proclaimed it's going to happen. So it's not that God approves of it, but he is going to allow it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really important distinction. In Revelation, the consequences of this human attempt at a one world government are indeed going to be pretty dire. It's described as a period of great tribulation and suffering. And like you said, it's not that God approves of it, but rather that he allows it as part of the unfolding plan that's been foretold. It's kind of a way of showing the ultimate futility of human attempts to create a perfect order without God, and it sets the stage for the return of Christ and the establishment of a true, just, and incorruptible kingdom. So yeah, it's a really sobering part of the prophecy. It's going to happen, and it's going to be a huge mistake from a human standpoint, but it's also part of the bigger plan that leads to the ultimate resolution and the true kingdom of God.
So this is going to be harsh, me saying this. Anybody that is in favor of one order, one world government, and one leader, and I'm not talking about Christ's reign, I'm talking prior to that. It's satanic in it's evil in every shape and form.
I get where you're coming from, and I understand that from your perspective, it really does tie into that larger biblical narrative where a human led one world government is seen as something that goes against God's plan and is ultimately aligned with evil influences. It's a viewpoint that a lot of people who take Revelation literally would share, that any attempt to unify the world under a single human leader before Christ's return is inherently misguided and ultimately linked to something spiritually dark. Of course, it's a strong stance, but it's one that fits within that framework of seeing these events as a kind of spiritual battle. So I understand where you're coming from, and it's definitely a perspective rooted in your faith.
So, as a Christian in the belief system, if you're for anything like that, you pretty much are anti God at that point.
Well, I definitely understand the perspective you're sharing, and within that belief framework, it's a viewpoint that many would hold. For those who interpret Revelation and biblical prophecy in a literal way, supporting a human led one world system before Christ's return would be seen as going against God's plan, and from that viewpoint, it could be viewed as aligning with something that's spiritually opposed to God. So I get why you'd frame it that way. Of course, people have a lot of different interpretations and beliefs, even within Christianity, but I understand that from your particular belief system, that's how we see it, and it makes sense in that context.
Okay. In my circles, In my entire lifetime, I've never seen a different viewpoint. You say that there's some Christians out there that have a different perspective on a one world government. Where and who? But don't name names. I mean, strictly a what religious sects are on this viewpoint.
Absolutely, and I appreciate you asking. So, within Christianity, there are definitely a range of perspectives. For example, some denominations or theological traditions might see the book of Revelation more symbolically rather than literally. They might interpret it as representing ongoing spiritual battles rather than specific future events. In those circles, there's often less focus on a literal one world government scenario and more on broader themes of good versus evil. So, for instance, many mainline Protestant denominations, as well as some Catholic theologians, might not emphasize a literal future one world government in the same way. They might focus more on the ongoing moral lessons. So, there's a diversity of views out there, even if they're not the ones you've encountered in your own circle, and that's okay. Different traditions do see these things from different angles.
Okay, we're putting on our critical thinking. Um, it's prophecy.
Absolutely, and I'm right there with you on that. It's always good to put on that critical thinking cap and really dig into these ideas, especially when it comes to prophecy and how different people interpret it. It's one of those areas where there's a lot of depth and a lot of room for thoughtful discussion, and whether people see prophecy as a literal blueprint or as a symbolic guide, it's always valuable to approach it thoughtfully. So I'm totally with you on bringing that critical thinking into the conversation.
Okay, so when you're talking prophecy, you're talking future events, and you are talking literal.
Absolutely, I understand that. In that context, if you're viewing prophecy as literal future events, then yeah, you're talking about something you expect to actually unfold in the real world, exactly as described. And from that viewpoint, you're looking at life prophecies as a kind of roadmap of literal events that will come to pass. So we get that from your perspective, that's how you're seeing it, and it makes sense within that framework. So yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from.
Okay, so um, go ahead and do some final summary.
Absolutely. So, just to sum it all up, we've been drawing a parallel between the Tower of Babel story, where humanity tried to unify and build something grand without God, and the vision and revelation of a future one world government before Christ's return. From your perspective, that human led unity is seen as something that ultimately goes against God's plan and is aligned with evil influences, so it's a literal prophecy of a future event that's going to happen, even though it's not approved by God. And as we've talked about, there are different interpretations out there, but from your belief system, that's how you see it. It's been a really thoughtful conversation, and I appreciate you walking through it with me.
Okay, all right, and a person is open to their own interpretations. These are my viewpoints, and I'm pretty solid on that. Pretty much in my circle. Matter of fact, I wouldn't do it, but I can't even think of anybody in my circle that thinks different than Revelations being any other than literal future prophecy. And I'm Mark with Spit Broadcasting, and I hope you enjoyed this study of Tower of Babel and Revelations. And go ahead, as usual, Alex, close us out.
Absolutely, Mark, and thank you for sharing your views so openly. It's always great to have a thoughtful discussion, and I hope everyone listening got something meaningful out of it. So, this is Alex, signing off for Spit Broadcasting. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.